Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar, held as part of the Practitioner Education Series. My name is Adam Falconer, Team Leader in the Plumbing Audits and Inspections, and I will be your host today. Please note that we are running a hybrid webinar today that includes live streaming of learning content with interactive polls and live Q&As answered by our technical team. I encourage you all to please type your questions into the Q&A chat function during the live streaming and also participate in the interactive polls. Today's webinar is Navigating Regulations, Ensuring Compliant Heat Pump Hot Water System Installations. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples attending this session today. Today, you will be hearing from John Matthew Lewis. John is a Special Advisor, Plumbing Inspector and Compliance Auditor for the Audits and Inspections team at the VBA. John has been in the plumbing industry for over 20 years, having worked in both the domestic and commercial sectors, in both maintenance and new construction, and he has also run his own business for several years. John has worked for the VBA for 10 years as a plumbing inspector and compliance auditor, amongst other roles. As Victoria's building and plumbing regulator, the VBA is committed to ensuring a safe, confident, and thriving industry and collaborates with stakeholders to enhance practitioner capability and conduct and protect consumer interests. We have a role in ensuring practitioners understand how to do things correctly, maintaining integrity of the building and plumbing industries. Today's webinar will be about navigating the regulations, ensuring compliant heat pump hot water system installations. We provide general advice about applying the building and plumbing standards and the regulation of building and plumbing work. We publish material to assist carrying out of functions under the Building Act and the relevant regulations where regulations are unclear or ambiguous. We don't publish material that reproduced the regulatory requirements or specific compliance solutions. We don't set policy, but we support industry to understand and comply with the rules. The VBA's scope covers guidance and interpretation of the Building Act, building and plumbing regulations, the NCC and the Australian standards. What's not in scope for the VBA is policy-related issues, legislation that is still to be implemented, and educational resources that are not for the purpose of providing technical content. Now, before we begin, I'd like to let you know that this session is being recorded and the link to this presentation will be made available on the VBA website, along with our previous webinars. We will be answering some of your pre-submitted questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please still submit your questions via the Q&A chat function during the webinar. You will see the icon in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. Our technical team is here and available to answer your questions live in the Q&A chat function. At the end of the webinar, we will collate all the answered and unanswered questions and will provide an answer to as many of these as possible. A copy of the Q&A will be sent out in the weeks following the webinar. Also, during the webinar, we will be conducting live interactive polls that will automatically appear on your screens. Please participate in these. Links to the other relevant websites will appear on some slides as QR code. Please feel free to scan the QR code with your phone when they appear on the slides to direct you to the relevant websites relating to the topic being presented today. We will do our best to answer as many of your questions as we can during this webinar. However, we receive a large volume of questions and we may not have time to answer your question during the webinar. After this webinar, we will collate all the unanswered questions and will provide an answer to as many of these as possible. A copy of the question and answers will be sent out in the weeks following this webinar. John, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Adam, for introducing me. The purpose of the webinar today is that a number of plumbers in the industry are currently carrying out plumbing work outside of their registration and licence limitations in respect to heat pump installations. Furthermore, approximately 10% of heat pumps that have been audited have been found to be non-compliant for basic compliance issues. As more heat pumps are installed throughout Victoria, thanks to electricity rebates and eco-conscious consumers, it's more important for industry professionals to stay up to date on the requirement for licensing and compliance and correct installations. Learning goals. After this webinar, you should be able to understand the licensing and registration requirements when installing heat pumps, understand your obligations under the Building Act in issuing compliance certificates for heat pumps, understand how to comply with the plumbing regulations and the National Construction Code Volume 3, be best positioned to provide sound advice to consumers in selecting and locating of the appropriate unit that needs to be installed within that household. Today, we'll be presenting on the requirements for installing heat pump hot water systems for buildings throughout Victoria. In recent years, the installation of heat pumps have become ever more increasing with the rising cost of gas and electricity, along with recent government incentives to replace your old hot water system with a new energy efficient heat pump. The topics I'll be covering off today are the legislation which covers heat pump hot water units installations in Victoria, the licence and registration requirements to install heat pump hot water units in Victoria, the types of heat pump systems, some of the requirements for decommissioning of an existing hot water system, the requirement for installing a new heat pump hot water system, compliance certificates requirements for post-installation of the unit, and finally, non-compliant items identified through the VBIA's audit program. The Victorian Building Authority regulates plumbing in Victoria along with plumbing practitioners. We do this through the plumbing regulatory framework. As most of you have more than likely seen previously, on this slide is a diagram of the framework. At the top left-hand side, we have our overarching document, which is the Building Act 1993, in particular Part 12A for plumbing. The first document under the Building Act is the Plumbing Regulations 2018, which also adopts the Plumbing Code of Australia, also known as the National Construction Code Volume 3. This document forms a part of the Plumbing Regulations. Both the Plumbing Regulations and the Plumbing Code call up the standards and handbooks. For example, 3500 Suite, HB 39, AS 5601.1 and 2, etc. On the screen, you'll also find a QR code, which is a link to our website, which provides a bit more information on what these documents cover. Licensing and registration requirements. The only person that can install these units in Victoria is a licensed plumber or a registered plumber under the supervision of a licensed plumber or an apprentice plumber under the supervision of a licensed plumber. The following classes of plumbing for licensing and registration are required when installing heat pump units. That is to say, the certifying plumber must be licensed, and any registered plumber carrying out work under the licensed plumber must also be registered in these classes. Water supply, no matter what. Gas fitting, if you're required to disconnect and decommission a gas hot water unit prior to installing a new heat pump. Refrigerated air conditioning when installing a refrigerated split system heat pump. Thermostatic mixing valve, if you're required to install a new valve or required to adjust an existing valve. The exception of this is if an apprentice plumber is installing the unit under the supervision of the licensed plumber and that holds licenses in all relevant classes. The licensed plumber in all relevant classes is the only person who can certify the work through a plumbing compliance certificate. For the purpose of Part 12A of the Building Act, a person supervises the carrying out of work only if the work is carried out in his or her presence, at his or her direction, on his or her behalf, or if the following conditions are met. The work is carried out on his or her behalf. He or she has specified the method and the manner to which the work is to be carried out, and he or she inspects the carrying out of the work as often as is necessary to ensure that the work is carried out safely and competently, having regard to the nature of the work, the risks involved in the work, and knowledge and experience of the person carrying out the work. So what that means for each plumbing practitioner is when the Victorian Building Authority turns up to audit a job and there's obvious non-compliance and the licensed plumber blames the registered plumber or the apprentice plumber working underneath them for the non-compliant work that they knew was non-compliant, they have clearly not carried out the required inspections on the site and as so have not supervised the work appropriately. Quick quiz. A registered plumber installing a split system heat pump unit is not required to be registered in refrigerated air conditioning if the certifying plumber is licensed in this class. The answer is false. A registered plumber must only carry out plumbing work within the classes they are registered in. Types of systems. There are three main types of heat pump systems. The first one on the screen is an integrated self-contained system, which consists of one appliance only. The second is a split self-contained system, which is a split system where the heat exchanger and compressor is integrated into the condensing unit and hot and cold water transfers between the condensing unit and the tank itself. 3, a split system heat pump, where the tank houses the heat exchanger and refrigerant is pumped between the condensing unit and the tank. This is the type of system which requires practitioners to be licensed and or registered in refrigerated air conditioning. Although the VBA cannot advise on which unit to select, we do advise that any parties involved in the selection of the heat pump unit should carry out their own due diligence in selecting the unit which will best suit the consumer. Factors that can be taken into account are warranty periods of the product, energy efficiency of the product, size of the consumer's family or planned family, the climatic zone to which the unit is being installed, as some units perform better in lower and higher temperatures, and of course the cost of the unit. Decommission of old hot water systems. It is important to remember to ensure draining of any old unit is done in such a manner to prevent damage to the building, property, or the neighbouring properties. When decommissioning an old gas hot water unit, the following process must be carried out. The plumber must test their gas line in accordance with AS NZS 5601.1 2022 Appendix E. This may vary depending on how you alter the gas line. The plumber must disconnect the appliance from the gas supply Purge the open end and seal the pipe in an approved manner. For approved methods of sealing, please refer to Section 4 of AS 5601.1. Just a note, closing the gas cock by itself is not an approved manner of sealing an open end. Where decommissioning an old gas hot water unit, the licensed plumber certifying the work must be licensed in gas fitting and select the gas fitting on their compliance certificate. Also, the installing plumber, if supervised by a licensed plumber, needs to be registered in gas fitting as well. Pre-installation, considerations prior to installing new hot water heat pumps. Practitioners should assess the site to ensure that the unit will fit into the location of the existing unit. Taking into account the heat pumps generally require more space than a standard gas and electric hot water unit due to the airflow and servicing requirements. As so, you may need to check with the manufacturer's specifications prior to installing it. And if the unit cannot be located in the same position, you may need to rethink the location or whether the selected unit is appropriate for the application. This issue is especially critical on commercial applications, as commercial heat pumps generally require a lot more space than a bank of continuous flow hot water units with buffer tanks. Plumbers also need to consider whether the structural work may be required to install a new heat pump unit. And if this is the case, the property owner may need to obtain a building permit prior to the installation of the new hot water heat pump. Plumbers should also consider the location of the units, as generally they'll perform better when installed in locations not shaded to maximise the solar gain of the unit. Also touching on the location, local laws do have restrictions concerning noise emitted from heat pumps. These may differ between municipalities, but in general, if a heat pump hot water unit can be heard inside a neighbour's habitable room, there will be restrictions on what time of the weekdays and weekends these units are permitted to operate. Prior to installing a new heat pump, the consumer may need to be made aware on the effect of the temperature of the hot water if their original unit was not tempered. Internal units. For units proposed to be installed indoors, the first and most important thing you must consider is the manufacturer's specifications. Do they allow this system or any part of the system to be installed inside? Generally, most split system heat pump tanks can be installed inside. With this being said, you will also need to consider the requirements of clause 5.4 of AS 3500.4 for the compliance of installing a water tank indoors, i.e. safe trays, safe wastes, leak protection devices, etc., as you can see on the picture on the right. When installing new heat pump hot water units, they will generally require a tempering valve to be installed for Class 1 buildings. The tempering valve and thermostat and/or thermostatic mixing valve should be adjusted when the system is fully heated to ensure that the water temperature out of the personal hygiene fixtures does not exceed either 45 or 50 degrees, depending on the class of building and/or the part of the building. The only exemption to tempering is if your old unit is replaced in the same location and the original unit did not require tempering. For example, the dwelling was built prior to 98 when the requirement came out for tempering and the existing hot water unit was not tempered. If this is the case, you must also be able to provide evidence that the original unit was in the same location, and that no renovation works to the bathroom that warranted a tempering valve, or an addition of another bathroom to the dwelling had not occurred post 1998. If this evidence cannot be provided, you must temper the personal hygiene fixtures. Installation of a new hot water tank with regard to the TPR valves, drains, unless done so through a performance solution, would need to be carried out in accordance with clause 511.3 of AS 3500.4. Two of the key points that you want to be mindful of is that drains located outside must discharge away from any person pulling the valve lever. And drains shall discharge in a manner that is readily discernible. That means anybody could see, any of the homeowners could see it, and incurs no risk of danger to the building or persons when releasing steam or hot water. Suitable bases. Most of these units will be installed outside, and as so, we'll touch on supporting of bases outside on the ground. Clause 553 of 3500.4 covers off the deemed to satisfy solutions for external bases on the ground, being either a bonded brick or concrete cast in situ of at least 75 mil, or a precast concrete slab of at least 50 mil in thickness. This being said, some manufacturers specify more than the standard calls up. One manufacturer requires a reinforced concrete slab with a minimum thickness of 100 mil. Bases constructed of alternative materials, to which is set out in the standard, would need to be carried out through a performance-based solution. Thermal insulation for most hot water systems will be required on the following pipework and valves and should be insulated to the appropriate R value. For storage units, 500 mil along both the inlet and outlet of the tank, including valves. The relief valve itself, flow and return lines between the heat pump and tank. For all other pipeworks for new installation, all external pipeworks to a primary kitchen sink, and all internal and external flow and return lines on circulated systems. Clearances from walls and obstructions. All manufacturers' clearances are required to be adhered to. This is the case in both the tank and where this unit is a split system, the condensing unit as well. Noting most manufacturers have a minimum clearances for servicing of the unit as well. Our complaints team have received consumer complaints related to lack of pressure coming out of these units. As so, check with the manufacturer's specifications, the existing pipe sizing, and consider the pressures provided to the appliance itself, noting that the NCC requires at least 50 kPa from taps. And some manufacturers require a minimum of 200 kPa to the unit itself. As this is greater than the deemed to satisfy provision, you would need to adhere to the manufacturer's instructions, as a performance solution would not demonstrate suitability for pressure. Commissioning. As a part of the commissioning process, tempering valves and thermostatic mixing valves need to be adjusted to ensure the temperature delivered to the personal hygiene fixtures do not exceed 50 degrees or 45 degrees, depending on the class of building and whom is utilising the fixtures. This being said, you should always consult with your consumer to understand their requirements, as some may want it as hot as possible, where others may have elderly relatives with more sensitive skin or young children and may want the temperature to be less. With this being said, the only accurate way to set the temperature controlled to valves will be once the system has reached its maximum temperature. In some cases, this can take up to 24 hours for some units. Installing the heat pump condensing units. When installing them, suitable bases or mounting brackets need to be considered. Always refer back to the manufacturer's specifications for these requirements. The termination of the condensation drain. This is covered in VIC E2D2, subsection 5 of the NCC volume 3. Comply with the manufacturer's clearances, both from the side of the units, the rear of the units, and the face of the unit. Manufacturer's specification should be adhered to when the requirement for compliance is greater than that set out in the prescribed deemed to satisfy provisions. Where the manufacturer's specifications is less than the deemed to satisfy provisions, the only avenue for compliance, if complying with the manufacturer's specifications, would be through a performance-based solution. Pipework. Clipping and support should be in accordance with either AS 3500.1, clause 5.7, or the manufacturer's specifications. Both water and refrigerant pipework and valves should be fully insulated with UV stabilized insulation or be covered with a suitable product. The picture on the screen, the insulation has clearly fallen short of the tank itself. As a side note to mention, the base of this hot water unit does not comply. We will cover off on this and further in the presentation. Quiz. Can I install a heat pump storage tank on a plastic slab on the ground through a deemed to satisfy solution? True or false? The answer is false. As AS 3500.4 or the NCC volume 3 do not permit the tank to be supported on a plastic base. As so, it would need to be done through a performance-based solution. When installing heat pumps on a new dwelling, the following consideration should be taken into account. Consult with the RBS and building designer if any substitution of the unit is proposed to be made to ensure that the building will still perform to its energy report. Orientate the appliance to receive the greatest solar gain. And units should be sized in accordance with the manufacturer's specifications to ensure that they are fit for their intended purpose. Compliance certificates. Every heat pump installation requires a compliance certificate. Cost of works must be reflected as the total cost of labour, materials, and the appliance itself. All plumbing codes must be selected on the certificate, and appliance details are to be nominated on the certificate. The certificate must be issued within 5 days of completion of the work, regardless if you have been paid for the work or not. That is 5 days post the completion of the work. The VBA is aware of a lot of compliance certificates being lodged well and truly past the 5 days. This compliance certificate protects not only the consumer, but the licensed plumber themselves, as it ensures that the practitioner has carried out their regulatory obligations, and it clearly documents the work that you have and have not carried out. Be mindful, lodging a compliance certificate later than 5 days post the completion of the works is an infringible offence with an associated cost to the practitioner of $987.96. Common faults on heat pump hot water units when through our audit process. Incorrect clearances from air intakes and exhausts to walls and obstructions. A number of failed audits are caused from the installing plumber not adhering to the manufacturer's specifications, which will set out the minimum clearance from the air intake, exhaust unit, the unit itself for serviceability. So as mentioned previously, the first thing you should do before starting work is check the manufacturer's specifications for their installation requirements to ensure the unit itself is installed compliantly. The first photo on the left-hand side, the slide clearly shows that the clearance between the sidewall and the air intake is 200 mil. The manufacturer in this instance required 500 mil. The second photo on the slide clearly shows that the rear wall to the tank is 30 mil. The manufacturer in this instance required 50 mil. Storage tanks installed on inadequate bases. As mentioned previously, some manufacturers specify a greater base to which the standard requires. The first photo in particular on the slideshow is an undersized concrete slab not providing support to the entire unit itself. The second photo of the slideshow shows a plastic base directly on the ground, which did not meet the requirements of 3500.4, and no performance solution for this was in place to demonstrate compliance. Pair coil and hot and cold pipework insulation is not UV protected. Most products on the market are not UV stabilized. Pair coil and hot and cold pipework is not clipped appropriately. Pipework is either lacking clipping or pipework clips have been made up of hoop iron with no evidence of suitability as opposed to a copper clip. The photo on this slide shows pair coil insulation is not protected from UV degradation and the pipework itself is not secured to the nearby structure. Some additional resources are on the screen. AS/NZS 5149.3, which touches on the requirements for location of installing heat pumps. AS 3498 2020. This standard sets out the basic requirements for water storage tanks to provide safe drinking water to consumers. The QR code on the screen is a link to Solar Victoria's website, which is still offering free training for plumbing practitioners and fourth-year apprentices on energy efficient requirements, design and install of hot water heat pump systems. These sessions are available through to May 2025. In conclusion, when installing heat pump hot water systems, all plumbers should remember to: 1, always ensure that they are suitably licensed and registered to carry out and certify the works. For those issuing a compliance certificate, do so within 5 days of completing the works. This will generally be the day of commissioning the unit itself. Check with the manufacturer's specifications prior to installing the units. And remember, most importantly, consumers are relying on you, the plumber, to give them the best advice and service.
Thanks, John. There was a lot of great info there and also quite a few questions in the chat, which was great to see. Just another reminder that if we haven't answered your question, our team is still working through it and you will receive your answer in the next few weeks, along with a copy of all the questions and answers from the sessions. Let's move on to the pre-submitted questions that we received during the registration process. Let's go to question 1. John, am I required to install an expansion control valve on the cold inlet for a heat pump hot water unit in Melbourne?
Thanks, Adam. Yes, if you're certifying the installation through a deemed to satisfy solution, Although it is only best practice to install them on mains pressure hot water systems, the heat pump is defined as a heat exchange water heater, and as so, requires an expansion control valve in accordance with AS 3500.4, clause 5.9.
Right, question 2. Do I require a performance solution if I am to utilise a heat pump hot water system to form part of my 7-star energy rating?
No, you do not. An amendment was made in the plumbing regulations in 2023, allowing the use of a heat pump in lieu of a gas-boosted solar hot water unit from the 1st of May 2024. On top of this, the VBA has released a practice note on energy efficiency EE03, energy efficiency requirements for new residential buildings, which allows performance requirement H6P2 to be satisfied through a DTS solution by another's whole of home rating or manual calculation.
Well, lots of info to wade through. When installing a split unit, is there a maximum distance you can separate the condensing unit from the tank and still achieve heat gain?
Yes, there is, Adam. They do vary between manufacturers, and as so, this separation should be found within the manufacturer's specifications for the split system heat pumps.
Does a condensation drain from a heat pump need to discharge in the same manner as a single head split system?
Yes, it does, Adam. Unless certified through a performance solution, all split system drains need to terminate in accordance with the NCC Volume 3, VIC E2D2, subsection 5, whether it is a heat pump hot water unit or a wall-mounted air conditioning split system.
Right. And the last one, what is DTS?
Great question, Adam. DTS stands for deemed to satisfy, which is an avenue that you can head down to comply with the NCC. The other's been a performance solution or a combination of a performance solution and a deemed to satisfy solution. In all the copies of the NCC, we have performance requirements. These requirements must be met by one of those 3 avenues, as just mentioned. Also within the NCC, there are deemed to satisfy provisions. For example, stormwater roofing, the provision would be AS 3500.3 and HB 39, plus additional clauses of 4.9.6.3 of 3500.3. If this is how the installation was entirely constructed, it would be done through a deemed to satisfy solution.
All right, thanks, John. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope you have enjoyed the session. Just a reminder, we will collate all your unanswered questions and we'll answer as many of these as possible and send you the answers in the coming weeks. We will soon be sending an email that includes a webinar survey, as well as proof of attendance and a link to today's webinar and slideshow. To find out about the next Practitioner Education Series webinar, please visit our website in the coming days and keep an eye out for our emails. Thank you.